Hi, I'm Patrick Sims. I used to go all over the globe researching the most direct form of political violence, insurgencies, guerrilla groups, Marxists, Maoists, Al Qaeda, different politicized movements that were trying to overthrow political orders with a gun. And at the same time, I was often focusing on true dictatorships like Cuba. I ended up writing 3 books about Cuba and Latin America and revolutionary movements. But I'm not talking today about dictatorships. I want to talk about authoritarians, a different creature. Historically, we've had examples like in the upper right there, that's Juan Perón with his wife Evita in Argentina in the 1950s. They basically ran a military coup, but were charming and beloved, and she was a master populist. Below that, Suharto, the Indonesian leader in the 60s, who adopted kind of left policies while seizing power like a military man. And of course, Hugo Chavez in the Red Beret. I'll come back to Venezuela. Today, we talk about a much more subtle type of authoritarian or populist leader. These are the Polish leader on the left, Viktor Orban of Hungary at the top on the right, Erdogan of Turkey. Very different countries and cultures, but all experiencing a similar authoritarian political spiral. So let me disambiguate for a minute how the different terms I'm using today interrelate. Authoritarianism, aside from being a long and painful word to spell, is 2 things: a set of values inside a person, and also a system, not just a dictatorship of one, but a coalition of interests. Had a great chance to spend a year at the University of Michigan researching authoritarianism. Here are some of my favorite books, very well thumbed at this point. And I like to bring a little, what I'm going to do today is bring a little ground truthing to their ideas, which influenced me so much. One of the biggest book in the stack was by Theodor Adorno. It's 1,000 pages long. I read it so you don't have to. He was the father of authoritarianism studies and found this startling evidence that even just after World War II, even in America, a substantial minority of people were just deeply authoritarian in their values and expectations. Guess what? That evidence holds up. It's still true today, not just in the United States, but worldwide, to such an extent that about 1/3 of people are authoritarian. It's probably strongly reflective of natal influence and some sort of innate tendency or temperament. Look at some of the explanations that theoreticians do come up with. Perhaps the 2 most influential that I have encountered. Post-materialism was the phrase of Ronald Inglehart, an anthropologist at the University of Michigan who just passed away. He documented through this vast human values survey project that ran 40 years and collected data from all over the world, that as people's material needs are met, they become more tolerant of difference in culture, more willing to live next to people who aren't the same religion as them, more willing to share economic resources, and more democratic in their personal and political attitudes, small d, democratic. So prosperity and stability created tolerance, but at the same time, economic insecurity and fast cultural change pushed people the other way, pushed people back towards less developed stages of, as he saw it, a series of stages of growing progressively more tolerant of others. Pippa Norris of Harvard blames this more on the cultural backlash in the United States than economic factors. That people with authoritarian expectations, whether it's personality, innate, or response to their situation, they take a lot of this stuff personally. They're driven largely by fear and take, the idea of ISIS being a risk to me is very potent. Look at certain politicians who talk about an enemy and an other. Othering is one of the most important techniques of an authoritarian politician and a demagogue. The other, of course, is destroying the idea of facts, of saying everything is fake. One of the many of the things that authoritarian leaders need to do to grab power run through shutting down independent voices that can judge or critique them. Now, as I said, I've seen this in action. I call this presentation Gunpoint in Venezuela because more than 10 years ago, I was robbed at gunpoint in Maracaibo, close to midnight. And how I got to the edge of a slum in Maracaibo alone at midnight at the end of a gun, surrounded by gangsters, is a long story, which I wrote about elsewhere. I just want to capture the idea of what happens when the gun, when violence, when conflict becomes the method of politics. And Venezuela was a master of that. Social conflict is a sustainable resource for the current government in Venezuela. Let's jump to another example of authoritarianism around the world, Brazil. Bolsonaro of Brazil is the very model of a modern major authoritarian. He ranted on Facebook about a city councilor in Rio, Marielle Franco, on the left there. That's me in some of the favelas. Marielle Franco was a newly elected representative who challenged Bolsonaro's authoritarian policies of policing in the slums. She was assassinated. And surprise, surprise, almost everyone linked to the assassination was in the immediate circle of Bolsonaro. On the left, you see how close the president's house, Casa de Bolsonaro, that green circle just slightly to the right of it, is the house of one of the killers, a guy named Lessa. And on the day of the murder, the trigger man was on the right in the white T-shirt with his arm around Bolsonaro, a guy named Quiroz. But he did go to see Bolsonaro's neighbor, Lessa. Lessa is the one who lived just a couple of houses down the alley. And the cell phone data shows that he and Lessa and Quiroz got in the car, drove across Rio. Quiroz shot her dead. And if you look, Bolsonaro denied knowing anybody involved in this, and all you have to do is go on Instagram. That's the top shot is of him with both killers on the right there. The middle shot is him with Quiroz, and the shot on the bottom is him with this karate instructor who was the one who threw the gun away and threw it into the Rio Bay. So you leave a lot of evidence behind. And what Bolsonaro was doing is a classic authoritarian play. He pushed for it. He intimidated that woman. He disliked her. She's a lesbian, and he insulted her. He always victimizes the black and brown Brazilians and blames them for everything and talks about the need for violence, saying you can't really be a policeman unless you kill somebody, and many other things like that. So the rhetoric gets real. Eventually, the people around you get the orders and instruction. And I want to look at another tough case of this, which is the Philippines. I spent about 25 days in the Philippines reporting for the New York Times on the campaign of vigilante murders that is occurring there against mostly drug users and drug suspects and drug addicts, but a lot of people are dying. The map here shows Manila, Greater Manila, and we documented and geolocated murder sites all over the city. We would geolocate them and investigate who was killed and why. The why part is kind of easy. That's Rodrigo Duterte, a popular and populist authoritarian leader of the Philippines. He easily won election by promising to kill and wipe out criminals and to murder them and to shoot them and to torture them. And he just continuously promised this. He said, I will kill more people than Hitler. constantly used this idea of demonstration violence, that he was going to straighten out the society by, just killing the elements that were causing problems in the Philippines, mostly crime. And the result was a huge campaign of off-the-books midnight killings by teams of vigilantes, extremely chilling example. And particularly, most of these societies around the world, they look for an authoritarian system that's blaming an outsider. It might be immigrants. In Venezuela, it would be the traders from the other side. But what was so striking about the Philippines is they don't have that. They don't have immigrants. They don't have an enemy inside. They don't have... So they ended up proving that you really can just blame anybody, even your own countrymen, even your fellow Filipinos, is enough to drive this authoritarian spiral where you let a demagogue help make you afraid and say, I will solve your problems by killing them and wiping them out. This is an extreme example of violence in politics. Let me come to a less clear-cut case, the United States of America. After doing my Michigan fellowship, I made 2 cross-country drives and was witness to a strongly rising current of authoritarian aspects in our society. This is last spring in 2020, the Michigan State Capitol was repeatedly surrounded and sometimes occupied by groups of armed people protesting against COVID and driven by gun rights and militia issues and QAnon theories and every kind of conspiracy theory, from the Boogaloo Boys, the nihilists who just think. From Michigan, I went on to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where at the fairgrounds I found a big militia rally going on with many hundreds of militia participants from the groups like the 3 Percenters and the Oath Keepers, Idaho Lightfoot Militia, many men armed with rifles and sidearms, but so were many of the civilians in the crowd. There was an auction with a lady's purse, which not only had a pocket in it to hold your pistol, it came with a pistol. It was a purse and pistol being auctioned off there. And as an extra bonus, they threw in an anticoagulation kit. And this was full of defensive, infuriated speeches by people saying, we're almost at the point where we're going to have to take it all back violently. And I went on from there back to my home in Portland, Oregon, which in the summer of 2020 was the focus of national focus of attention for angry and sometimes violent demonstrations outside the federal courthouse in support of Black Lives Matter. And in the upper right there, you see photos I took at the memorial to George Floyd in Minneapolis on my way home. We are in grave danger. The kind of violence I've seen around the world is just within reach now in this country. The polarization of Venezuela, the vigilante killings of the Philippines, the authoritarian movements believe they can rule democratically by using violence. That is their secret weapon. Intimidation, threats of violence are routine now in American politics, and we have to take steps to fight back. Those are mostly, even if we need national leadership, those are mostly local steps. Those are mostly about rebuilding community, winning local ballot initiatives, getting control of state houses. Those are the ways that you disarm these aspirational nihilists with their desire for a destruction of America in order to rebirth it in their image. We don't want to go there. I've already been there. Thank you.